My name is Conrad Эгуsa. I am from Silicon Valley in New York. Although many people have told me so far that I look like I'm from Kazakhstan, which I think is a great thing. It seems like amazing people here. Um, my aim for this presentation is to take everything that I've learned about creating and launching a product and to give that knowledge to each of you. I'm happy to send this presentation to everyone after, and if anyone would like to connect, please send me an email or LinkedIn. I'm always really happy to talk. Just about myself, my background is a hybrid of the media industry as well as startups. I've raised funding for 4 startups in Silicon Valley. I was also a writer in New York for a technology publication called VentureBeat. Have you ever heard of like a TechCrunch? Maybe a raise of. So I also write for TechCrunch, for Forbes, a handful of the others. I founded a media incubator called Espacio. It's a team of about 70 journalists, and kind of an owner of a number of media publications. I actually wanted to, even before this, I wanted to start to mention kind of part of my past and why I think it's so fantastic that each of you are attending today. To me, I really encourage you to get to know not only the speakers but also the other people in this room, and I kind of wanted to take you back to when I was first starting off. I was 19 years old when I raised funding in Silicon Valley for my first startup, and I remember I used to stay up super late, up till about 3 or 4 a.m. working on this company, and it was just really this idea. I was 19 years old. I didn't really know what I was doing, but I remember that working really hard, my professors, these students around me began to support me, began to refer me to investors and these other people. And there was one that I was introduced to that I drove down to San Jose. I stayed up the night before putting together this presentation. And I met this investor in this very fancy restaurant. At the time I barely, probably $5 to my bank account. And I remember I brought him this PowerPoint presentation that I was about to show him for my startup, and he said, "Hey, Conrad, how much money are you looking to invest in? Are you looking to raise for your startup?" And I think I told him it was about $150,000 that I was looking to raise. And before I'd even opened up my PowerPoint, he said, "Hey, Conrad, I'm gonna invest in your company." He said, "I'll invest that much money. You'll get into a bank in about 48 hours." And I remember I looked at him, I said, "Yeah, but you haven't even looked at my presentation. I stayed up till 3, 4 a.m. putting this thing together. I was really excited to show you it." And he said, "Conrad, I don't even need to look at that presentation because I know there are people that I trust who have told me about you and have said really good things. And like what matters most to me is your reputation. How hard are you going to work? Are you going to be honorable with how you pursue this startup? Those things are much more important than anything you could put on this PowerPoint." So again, one of the things I'd encourage each of you to do is, again, not only get to know some great speakers here, get to know people like Nursultan from NATD and all the organizations and Techstars, but also just keep in mind that it's amazing. In a few years, you're going to come back, and the people you meet in this room, they're going to be the leaders in the ecosystem. And like the one kind of constant is like the reputation. It's how hard you work, how honest you are in these pursuits. Okay, I'm gonna go on to the second story, and this goes back to how, when you're building this startup and you want to launch it to the world, how can you best go about doing that? And I want to bring you back. This is actually a picture of someone named Eric Schoenfeld. He was the editor at TechCrunch many years ago, and I remember going back to Silicon Valley. I'm working on this startup. I want to launch it. And I remember I actually ran into this person in the elevator, and I was so nervous around him, this editor at TechCrunch, this really important person, that I told him he was a tech celebrity, and I just ran out of the elevator. I was so embarrassed. And he gave me this kind of odd look, like, who is this founder? Like, what is he doing, right? And because back in the day, I remember thinking, like, hey, if you get on this TechCrunch, if you get on Forbes when you're launching a company, these large newspapers, that's kind of when you know you're going to be successful, right? So how can you go about doing that? And I had no idea how to be on these large publications. How could I launch my company? And that's basically what I want to explain to each of you. this kind of process that you can use when you are about to launch your company to be really successful. And there are a few parts of this presentation, but the first part is what I call this 6-step process. And there's an acronym for it. The acronym that I use is called FAMOUS. So you won't be able to forget this, okay? And I was thinking about the best way to explain how can you follow this 6-step process to get featured on these large media publications to launch your company. And I'm actually going to use this example. And this example is of a co-working space that I founded called Espacio. And the reason why I use co-working spaces as this is an example is when you think about it, co-working spaces aren't that exciting, right? You're kind of renting an office space. And there are many started around the world every single month, right? And yet, when we did launch this co-working space, we were on TechCrunch, we were on the BBC, the Financial Times. It was a really successful launch, a launch that a lot of people would want to have. And I want to explain exactly what we did. This even has example emails as well. And the idea is that all of you can use those same principles for your own companies as you go about launching it. Because the launch of your company is really successful because it creates a sense of momentum that a lot of people can get around. So I want to explain what I did. Okay, let's get started. The first step in the famous acronym that each of you should use when you want to launch your company is formulate. Now, when I was writing for VentureBeat in New York, a lot of people would come up to me and they would say, Conrad, can you write about my company? And I would say, sure, you're my friend. What do you have to announce? And they would say, well, we don't have anything to announce. And I would say, well, if you don't have anything to announce, then I can't write anything for VentureBeat, for these publications, because there's no story there. And they would ask me, they'd say, what makes for a good story? And in general, in this case, for each of your companies, you're going to have these story announcements in the upcoming months. Let's say in a month from now, you decide to launch your company. That makes for a great announcement. Maybe 2 months later, you raise a small amount of funding, or you launch a new product, maybe a mobile app. Each of those make for great stories. So it's important when you contact anyone that you are really upfront and say, hey, for example, I'm about to launch my company. Would you be interested in covering the launch of this? And in many cases, when you contact these large publications, that actually becomes the title of the article. So in this case here, you can see in TechCrunch, they wrote, Co-working Space Espacio launches. That was the specific announcement that we made. I want to go to step 2, which is called Amplify. This might be the most important step in actually the famous acronym. And I'd mentioned before that most co-working spaces, the story itself, the company, it's not that exciting. And the reality is most of your companies, when you're starting off, actually aren't that exciting. And the reason for that is you might have 2 or 3 people working on this idea, right? You've limited resources. A company like Google might have 5,000 kind of professional engineers compared to kind of the 2 or 3 that you have. But what I always tell people is really exciting is you as founders, as entrepreneurs, where do you want to take the company in the next 2, 3, 5 years? That is a really exciting announcement. So in the case of the co-working space Espacio, I'd mentioned before, renting office space isn't that exciting. But that wasn't why we decided to launch this company. We launched this company because we wanted to turn the city of Medellin in Colombia into the Silicon Valley of Latin America. That was the big mission that we were aiming for. So what I always like to tell people is, do you all know when you're in the gym or you're about to go to bed and you're like daydreaming about how big your company is going to be in 2 or 3 years, right? You're going to have like 200 employees, you're going to be taking over the world. Do you guys all have that kind of daydream as well about how big your company is going to be? Let me get a little nod of the head. Okay, well, whatever that vision you see, that daydreaming in 2, 3 years, that's what you should talk about when you're announcing your launch, that big mission of the company. And it's so funny because many of you are probably thinking, wow, I just read this, I'm reading in the newspapers about these big ambitious startups, and they're in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and Fox, all these big publications. And I always think about it, I'm like, you guys don't understand. Many of those people are like living in the basements of their parents' house right now, right? Like they're not any different than any of you, right? The difference is, though, they're just talking about these ambitious plans where they want to take the company in the upcoming years. So I really encourage you to kind of focus less about where the company is today and more about where you want to take it. Because again, that's what's really exciting. Some questions you can ask yourself are, what's your company going to look like when it has 100 employees? How is your company going to change the world? These are kind of these important questions about amplifying the kind of the bigger mission of your company. Okay, so that's step number 2. The third step in this famous acronym is messaging. And the idea is, let's say you have this idea, you create this prototype of your product. How do you basically get that idea into the homepage of these large media publications, et cetera, these large influencers? And they're basically 2 documents that you need. And I have examples here as well. And again, I'm happy to send this PowerPoint after. You're going to need a press release, and you're going to need an email pitch explaining. And I want to kind of explain the purpose of each. The goal of an email pitch tends to be about 200 words long. And again, this is what you would send, whether it's to a television station, whether it's to a blogger or an influencer, or et cetera. And it basically sells somebody on why they should promote your story. And the role of a press release is, once they are interested in writing about you and your companies, to make it as easy as possible for them to do so. And I want to explain, I want to try to give you all the secrets that I have about this. And here's one of them. When you think about the largest international media in the world, right, let's say the TechCrunches, the Mashables, the VentureBeats, if I were to ask you how much money do they pay each of their journalists per article, what would you tell me? And these are people living in New York, in London, in San Francisco. Let me get a couple of guesses. What number comes to mind? Exactly. $2,000-$3,000. Okay, what other guesses? $100. Okay. Let's get maybe one more guess. How much? These people live in the most expensive cities in the world, in New York, in London, and San Francisco. Okay, we have a few $1,000s and $100. So the answer for many of the world's largest media publications, living in San Francisco, living in London, living in New York, right, is many of these people get paid $20 per article. Now, I want to let that sink in, because there are a lot of repercussions of this, okay? One of the repercussions, if you think about it, if you're living in New York or San Francisco and you're making $20 per article and you're paying a ton of money for rent, that means that you have to create a ton of articles, right? So when you think about it, if you pitch a journalist in New York City, right, like they know when they receive an email from you, is that article going to take them 20 minutes to write? Is it going to take them 6 hours to write? So because of that, there's a natural incentive for them to write articles and choose stories that they'll be able to publish in less time, right? So if you know this ahead of time, your goal is to say, hey, I know that you're going to try to write as many articles as you can. And I know that you're going to have to do a lot of research on my company. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do all that research ahead of time. And I'm going to put it in a press release. So when you do get that story pitch, it's really easy for you to write about, right? So, and here's an example, right? Let's say you are launching a company to help the education market in Kazakhstan. Well, if you think about it, if you pitch that story to, let's say, a Mashable or a VentureBeat, right? They're probably going to have to do research on, like, hey, how big is the educational market in Kazakhstan, right? Is it $10 million? Is it $100 million? $1 billion? Whatever it is, right? So what you can do is say, hey, I'm going to do that research ahead of time to make it easier for you to write this story. Does that make sense? The goal of the email pitch is basically to again, sell a journalist on why this is so exciting. And to me, there are 4 parts that I want to highlight. The first is to lead with social proof. So again, when you think about it, and I call social proof type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is the really impressive social proof, right? So let's say you graduated Nurse Sultan, a graduate of UC Berkeley, right? Fantastic university. I could know nothing about, I might not know Nurse Sultan, I might not have, but I can already tell if somebody graduated from UC Berkeley or Stanford or Harvard, they probably work really hard. They're going to be more likely to be successful. Or maybe they used to be an engineer at Google. These are really impressive things about themselves. What I call, let's say you say, hey, I don't really have that much information that's that impressive about myself. That's what I call type 2. So let's say you have something interesting about your story that you can highlight. So let's say you're a 15-year-old developer, or you're a 65-year-old founder, or let's say you used to be homeless or used to be a sports star. These are really interesting things about yourself that you can add to an email to make somebody interested in wanting to share information about your company's launch. And the reason why I mention that is I remember there was this 15-year-old who wrote me. He said, Conrad, I'm a 15-year-old founder in Australia. No one from TechCrunch will ever want to write about me. And I said, no, you don't understand. They will want to write about you because you're only 15 years old. There are not many 15-year-olds writing TechCrunch every day, right? So it's really interesting talking to founders from Kazakhstan, because you might think, why would any founder, any big, let's say, international publication, international journalist, want to write about me because I'm a founder in Kazakhstan. I don't know any of these people. I said, yeah, but that's the whole point. There are not many people from Kazakhstan pitching these stories. So it becomes really interesting, right? Everything that you guys are doing, because each of you is really unique, it becomes really interesting. The second thing I want to mention is to include links to your social profiles, whether it's LinkedIn, whether it's Twitter, etc. And the reason why I mention this is there are actually a lot of, when you're launching a company and you're contacting the media or influencers, etc., there are actually a lot of fake stories that are being sent out, unfortunately. And when you include something like your LinkedIn or Twitter, you're saying, hey, I might not know you, but maybe we have mutual connections, etc., and I'm putting my name behind this story. And that's really important. That's something that people want to see. The third thing is any influencer, any journalist that you contact, address their in the subject line in the email, include their name. And I found this dramatically will improve kind of any response rate that you get. Just something as simple as including somebody's name. And the last thing is that people do read their emails. So another secret for each of you to know is I remember at VentureBeat about half our stories that we covered every single day were sent to tips@venturebeat.com. So again, all of these emails that you send are read. I mentioned press releases. They follow a very specific format. I actually have another of examples here if anyone wants to look at them. To me, it's really important when you do launch your company to have some type of information in a press release about, hey, who are the founders? Where's the company based? What is it doing? Kind of this information to, again, make it easier for people to write a story. Again, I'm happy to send this presentation after to everyone, so no worries about that. Okay, so I want to continue back to this co-working space story. We were launching this company Espacio, and when we launched, as you guys saw, we were on TechCrunch. And then right after, I was emailing all of these other influencers and bloggers and publications, and I emailed somebody from the Next Web, which is another large publication. And the writer said, Conrad, thank you for sending me this story about your company's launch, and we would love to cover it, but the challenge is I already saw that TechCrunch wrote an article about this. So it's kind of old news already. One of our competitors has already written about it. We're going to pass on writing about your company's launch. So one of the challenges that all of you have is when you go about launching your company is that a lot of these influencers and publications compete with one another to break stories. Historically, that's how the New York Times, the BBC, etc., that's how they built their reputation, kind of breaking these stories, being the first one to write about it. So this becomes a big problem actually for a lot of founders, because you think, well, I want to get it on as many as possible, but once one publication writes about it, others will be less likely to. And there are basically two ways to go around this challenge. The first is called an exclusive, and the second is called an embargo. So I'll kind of break down each one. When you offer an exclusive to somebody, so let's say you say, hey, I'm about to launch this, I really want this to be on the Wall Street Journal. I'm going to email a journalist there and offer them an exclusive. Say, hi, John, would you like an exclusive to write about my company launch? You will be able to publish the story first, and once it goes online, you can contact other influencers, other bloggers to write about it. And a benefit that each of you have is that you can kind of guarantee a certain amount of coverage for your company launch, which is going to be really successful after, etc. The second option is called an embargo. And the embargo is you say, my company, we're about to launch it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to contact, let's say, 15 of the largest newspapers in Kazakhstan, internationally, etc., and say, you know what, next Wednesday, we're going to make our launch. Would you be interested in covering, next Wednesday at 1 o'clock, if you'd be interested in covering it, I'll send you all the information for you to write about this, and it'll be kind of a big launch event, etc. And actually, many of you experience embargoes every single day. You just don't necessarily realize it. So have you ever noticed, let's say the government of Kazakhstan or a big company here will make an announcement at like 1 o'clock in the afternoon, right? And then like at 1:01, all of the newspapers have already written about it. And when you think about it, it's like, how is it possible that they could all write stories about it within like 1 minute? It's impossible, right? And the answer is they were actually given the information ahead of time, but they agreed to this embargo to not publish anything until a specific time. So all of you experience that every single day. Now, again, a lot of people say, well, okay, if we're about to launch our company, should we offer an exclusive or an embargo? And what I usually tell people is it's kind of a risk reward. With an exclusive, you can guarantee a certain amount of coverage. So you can say, hey, at the very least, I know that one of these big publications and newspapers and influencers is going to write about my company. And you kind of have that there. With the embargo, maybe no one writes about it, but on the other hand, maybe many, many organizations and influencers do. I call this the fifth step unrelenting. One of the things as a founder for you to keep in mind is that kind of presume that unless you contact people asking them to promote about your launch, to share your story, etc., presume that they won't unless you contact them. So one of the things we did, we spent about 100 hours creating this free, this is a free reporter list for a lot of tech journalists and bloggers and influencers. If you click on that link, you'll find the emails, etc. of people. And I'm happy, if you want to write me after, I can give you kind of access to a larger database. But I remember back in the day, I'd be like, hey, I'm about to launch this company, and now I have to go online and like search everyone's emails to contact, right? So I basically just put that in a free list for anyone, if you'd like to see it. There are actually a lot of, when you're launching a company, a lot of really popular platforms, and one, for example, is called Product Hunt. Have any of you guys ever heard of Product Hunt before? We got a couple, awesome. So Product Hunt, the way for anyone who hasn't used it before, it operates similar to kind of like a Reddit or a Dig, where people can post their products and people can upvote them on this homepage. And the ones that get near the top tend to be seen by tens of thousands of people. So it's a very successful platform to launch your product. But there are a couple secrets that I'm going to tell you guys about, which are very important. And the first is that what most people do when they visit Product Hunt, you're about to launch your company, let's say in 1 month, is they go to submit their product, and what they realize is that A, most people aren't able to submit their products, or B, what tends to happen is they'll submit their product, but it won't hit the homepage, which is where everyone actually visits. So if you do decide on a company launch, and you want to use a platform like Product Hunt, or even like a Reddit, what I always recommend to people is to contact a moderator on one of these platforms and ask the moderator to submit your product, which many of them are actually really happy to do. And what will happen is your product will immediately hit the homepage, which is where tens of thousands of people visit, and you're going to be much more likely to be really successful with this launch. I actually have a list of moderator emails that I'm happy to send anyone who emails me about it. But again, when you're launching a product on any of these social platforms, whether it's Product Hunt's a great one, again, I think Reddit's another very popular platform, I really recommend kind of going through that route of contracting moderators for these people. What I call the last step in the famous acronym is called strategize. And the idea is the launch is really important, but keeping in mind that all this marketing, it compounds over time. So to me, the most successful companies, whether it's startups that have raised millions of dollars, whether it's one of the people I help with is the chief evangelist of Microsoft, whether it's a big company like Microsoft, they are constantly making new announcements. So for each of you, it's important to focus on your launch, but at the same time, keep in mind, what new announcements can you make to contact these influencers, to contact these publications as you continue to go on? And ideally, again, the most successful ones I've seen make announcements every 8 to 12 weeks. Okay, so I'm going to tell you guys this story, and this might be the most important slide that you guys see all today, okay? And so I mentioned I was a writer in New York for VentureBeat. And I remember one of the things I found was that what a lot of people believed to be true wasn't always true. And I'll give one example. So if I were to ask somebody, hey, how do you get on the New York Times? What most people here would say is, hey, if I want to be on the New York Times or TechCrunch, I need to be best friends with a journalist or an editor who writes at that publication. Would you agree with that? See, maybe most. Okay, so I see a lot. So one of the things I found being a part of the media industry is that actually wasn't true. Actually, I found just that same acronym, the famous acronym, I found that if you follow that process, you can get media results, regardless of whether you're not a founder in Kazakhstan or Australia, etc. And I said, you know what, I want to prove it. So after I left VentureBeat, I remember I got this call from a founder of Safely Filed. He's based in the middle of the country in the US. He's a 65-year-old founder. He said, Conrad, I don't know anyone in the media industry. Can you help me with the launch of my product? And I said, you know what, I'm going to help you, but there's only one thing, okay? I said, no one can know that I'm involved. So he created this email for me. His name's Mark Snow. And he created an email that was marksnow@safelyfiled.com. And I would email as it, right? When I contacted the New York Times, etc., I said, hi, John, my name is Mark Snow, right? No one knew that Conrad Эгуса was involved at all. And I remember I followed the exact same process, the famous acronym that I just explained to you. I formulated into an announcement, I amplified it, right? I used social proof, put it into a press release and email. And I remember I contacted all these people, right? And I went to bed that night, and I was super nervous because I'm thinking, man, like, is this process actually going to work, right? Everything I just explained to you. Or is it all about this relationship, right? So I wake up the next morning, and I check my email, and I have no responses, right? No one has, no journalist, no influencer has responded to my emails. And I'm super upset at this. I'm like, oh, maybe everything I just explained to each of you, maybe it's actually all wrong, right? I said, but let me just give it 24 hours, okay? I just need 24 more hours more. So I go to bed that night. I wake up the next morning. I go to my computer, and I'm super nervous again. Because again, I'm wondering, like, hey, is the process that I just explained, does it actually work, right? Or is it just all because, I'm best friends with these people, right? No one knows that I'm involved. And I go and check my email, and there are no responses again. And I'm just super depressed at this point. I'm like, oh, this is just terrible. I'm so sad. And then suddenly, I get this phone call, and it's the founder, Mark Snow. And he says, Conrad, you've done a really great job. We've gotten all these media results. And I said, how is this possible? And I realized, I said, you know what, I'm emailing as Mark Snow, as his fake email address, right, that he created, and I'm checking my own personal accounts. So I'm like, oh. So I go and check, and then I realized that VentureBeat, all these publications have written about this. So this is the founder right there, VentureBeat, this is the Next Web, these other ones. And everyone would come up to me, they'd say, Conrad, of course you got it on these media publications. You used to write there, you're friends with these people. I'd say, no, you don't understand. No one knew that I was involved. It's about the process. So everything that I'm explaining to you all right now, this is all things, the beauty of if you do reach out to influencers, the media, this is inherently free to do, and it's all things that each of you can do as well. And I hear it over and over again, people saying, hey, I know I'm this founder in Kazakhstan or in South America, I can't get on these international publications. And I say, no, you don't understand. I have thousands of data points to say that you can. If you do follow, again, these similar emails, etc., if you follow that process, you can get these media results. And actually, just to take it a step further, one of the things I did after is we tested this across 30 data points. So I'd said, hey, let me email as the company itself, as myself, or as a random team member. And we put people into different tiers based on their kind of design, et cetera, the company. And we found that the results were almost the same across the board. So again, going back to it, like I really encourage you. Many people, they think like, hey, there's no way I can get on a TechCrunch, et cetera. I just don't know these people. I'm building a company in Kazakhstan, et cetera. And I'd say, it is possible. I see it happen over and over again, and it's all things that, again, each of you can do these things. Okay, maybe before I go to the second part, any questions so far about this? Yeah. Yeah, so product hunt, I'd say probably about several dozen that we have, from publications to different products as well. Um, the conversion is a little harder. So and the reason why, for sure, I would say the most successful ones probably have brought between 4 to 5,000 visits within like a 24 to 48 hour period. So kind of about that much. Yeah. The conversion, it's harder just because if we launch like a new publication, most people when they visit don't convert, if that makes sense. Um, Also with product hunt, a lot of it depends on if you're kind of number 1 or 2 versus like kind of later on. But again, the great thing about product hunt as well is that it's just a free medium that everyone can use as well. And in general, when you're starting off and founding a company, like you have less money and you have more time. So these are kind of these important. And then as you grow, you have less time and you have more money. But these are just important mediums to use. Yeah. Yeah. In this specific example, I believe it was an embargo for for a specific date. For sure. And I did want to mention, even if you do offer an exclusive, you can still email others once it comes online to further coverage. So it's not that if you offer an exclusive that you can only get one result, but it's more that you kind of guarantee a certain amount as opposed to an embargo where there's just kind of a higher risk reward there. Ex- exactly, 100%. Let's see, any other questions so far? Okay, I'm gonna continue. So this is something that I found to be super effective. That again, everyone here can use. They can use it. It's free and it's very effective. So I mentioned before in the last about a few slides that to me the most successful companies make announcements every, let's say, eight or so weeks. And when you think about it, if it's every 8 weeks, there's usually a down period between that during that time where, hey, you do want to stay active to get more promotions about your company, about your launch, etc. And I remember with the co-working space, Espacio said, well, hey, how can I best do that? And I said, well, what if I write articles not just about the co-working space, but actually about the startup scene, something that has to do with the company that can kind of keep us in the news. So if I did write an article, it would say Conrad Эгуса, CEO of Espacio, etc. And here's an article that I wrote for TechCrunch on Colombia's startup scene. Because again, Espacio was a co-working space. And this is actually the exact email I sent to TechCrunch asking them to publish it. I didn't know the editor at the time. So what I mentioned in this email, and I'm happy to send the PowerPoint after, each of you can use a similar template of this model to look to publish articles underneath all of your own names. And I'll give an example. Maybe, do you have a startup right now? Okay, which industry is it in? Awesome. So let's say let's say one growing market within that is, let's say, connecting people to accountants as an example. Let's say, and the thing is, if you reached out to a TechCrunch or Forbes, etc., Entrepreneur Magazine, and said, hey, I want to write an article about why my startup that connects people to accountants is great, right? They'll be like, hey, we just can't publish this. It's just way too self-promotional, right? But if what you said was, hey, I have a startup that connects people to accountants, can I write a guest article about how technology is changing the accounting industry for, let's say, for Inc. magazine or Wired magazine? Many of those people would say, yeah, sure, we're happy to publish that article. And then in that article is going to have your name and a link back to your website. In the byline, it'll have your photo, etc., right? And what'll happen is when that article comes online, many people will read it and say, hey, this is a really interesting topic. Let me actually click through and visit your website. And many of them will actually sign up as clients. And again, this is a free thing that all of you can write these articles, can look to get them published. And I found it to be super effective. And I really recommend. And the great thing about this as well is that it applies to any industry. So let's say right now, each of you, let's say you're a consultant right now. Let's say you have a consultancy for social media. Well, one of the things you can do is say, hey, let me contact these big newspapers and write an article about advice on social media. And then again, even though it doesn't directly promote your company, it's going to have a link back to your website in the author line, etc. So it'll generate new leads for your company. And again, I find it to be incredibly effective and it's free for people to do. They can write these articles themselves. To me, the biggest thing to keep in mind is what most people do is they say, I don't know this editor yet, but let me email somebody from TechCrunch and say, hi, my name is Sebastian. Can I contribute a guest article? And usually the editor, what they say is like, hey, I don't know this person. What if I say yes, and then the article is not very good? So they'll say, you know what, let me just not respond because it's just easier to not respond. So what I always recommend, the first time that you contact an editor, actually have the first article finished. So when you send the email to the editor, similar to this email, you would say, hi, my name is Sebastian. I would love this article attached to be considered for your publication. And one of the things I found is that many of the editors will say, hey, this is actually a really good article. We're happy to publish it. And then over time, what you'll find is that they'll say, hey, you know what? We really liked your article. Whenever you want to submit anything, here's WordPress, here's access to our website. You can submit it, whatever you can. So you kind of build a relationship over time. And by doing the first article in the very beginning, it's kind of like your foot in the door to building that relationship. Okay, I wanted to mention kind of what's a lot of this all for, these efforts. And one of the things you'll find when you're first launching is that it can be really hard to do, right? And reaching out to influencers, reaching out to the media, trying to generate as much buzz as possible. A benefit that you have is that over time, it becomes a lot easier. And it becomes easier because you look to kind of own share of mind in a specific space. And this person right here, he's the founder of 500 Startups, Dave McClure. And one of the things he found is that in the very beginning, it was really hard to get media coverage, but later on, when people were writing about investment or accelerators, they would include him in the articles, even if he didn't reach out to the media. Because whenever people thought about something, they would include him in those articles. So what I always recommend to each of you is whatever company, whatever industry or space you're in right now, think that your goal should be to kind of own share of mind. So whenever I think of social media in Kazakhstan, I should think of this person. If I'm writing an article, I should be referred to them, right? Or whoever it is. Maybe you're in social media, maybe you're in development, maybe you're finding your own startup, but your goal should be kind of essentially own share of mind in that specific space. I think in the short term, a lot of the goals for your launch are how do I drive new visits? How do I drive the number of social media mentions online, et cetera? How do I drive conversions to purchases, et cetera? Over the long run, your goal should be to basically kind of, it's a little harder, but to own share of mind in this specific space. Okay, I just want to talk about the media industry really quickly, kind of where it's heading to in the upcoming years and how you can kind of take advantage of this as well. I think the first is that, to me, historically, if you go back 20 years, contacting these newspapers and media, it was all, when your company was launching, it was all about contacting journalists. And about 15 years ago, it began to be about contacting journalists and bloggers, right? These really influential bloggers. And I think in the future, it's about contacting journalists, bloggers, and also gatekeepers. So when you think about it, for any of your company launch, you're not just going to be contacting bloggers and influencers. You might be contacting, let's say, the producer of a popular YouTube show that has a really great audience, right? Or it could be contacting a moderator at Product Hunt. But the benefit that you have is the strategy you use is actually going to be similar across the board, irregardless of who you're contacting. The second thing is, because a lot of publications are going to be making layoffs, they're going to be looking for people like yourself to contribute these articles. And even if they're things that people don't get paid for, I have seen people get a return on investment from it. Kind of like what I mentioned before. I also wanted to mention, to me, when you think about the PR industry, it's almost going to expand to all communication as well. So one of the things you'll find is, again, I've raised funding for 4 startups in Silicon Valley. I found actually pitching an influencer or the New York Times about a company, it's actually very similar to raising funding as well. You're using social proof, you're making your story as big as possible as well. They're kind of similar elements. And the last thing, sometimes people ask, hey, how do you go from internet famous to mainstream for any of your companies as they continue to grow? I recommend focusing on images and video, because these are much more powerful mediums as well. Just something to keep in mind. Okay, before I get started on creating your product, any questions on just some of, yeah. For sure.
Now we understand our mistakes that we do. That we try to ask journalists to publish something, sharing our portfolio of products, but we do nothing to prepare it.
For sure.
So that's number one homework for us. And my question is about the storyline. For example, you have a great event, but you're not preparing to cover it in media. For example, one big head of the World Bank is coming to a small city, Stepnogorsk, and they have so not every day the head of the World Bank comes to a small city and looks for the project. So from the side of a storyline, it's a great opportunity to cover it, but you don't prepare for that.
Yeah.
And then after he visited, and then it takes 1, 2, 3 weeks, and then this story is not the latest one. So what would be your tips of how to cover things that already passed?
Yeah.
The events already passed, something interesting but not relevant at that time. So
for sure.
The momentum was lost, but how are we going to cover it?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. I mean, the first thought that came to mind is, ideally, especially for those specific events, if someone from the World Bank visits a small, I would say ideally someone would have taken photos as well. And there's still that opportunity then to say, hey, even if it's just a few lines of, here are 3 or 4 photos, and here's some of the things that this head of the World Bank said when he visited this town, etc. That's still enough there to write an article, but the key is to focus on the images and on that visit, on that specific visit. I can't say it enough. Images and video are so powerful. And just as one example of this, I remember in the United States there was an election in 2016, and if there was always a lot of this news on Trump versus Clinton, and I remember there were always all these articles about Donald Trump disrespecting women, etc. But it was only when the video came out, where people could actually watch him saying these things on video, that it really clicked to people about wow, that's much more powerful. It kind of hits us. So to me, going back to this specific example, if there's any video of the person visiting the town or photos of him, I still think that's a fantastic opportunity to pitch that story, and it's something people should want to cover. Yeah. Yeah.
They want us to make some money for that.
Yeah.
And if it's already passed, it's a clear informational article.
For sure. Well, I would say for certain. So historically, for example, the media industry, many of the large publications, the way they actually monetized was via these conferences. So a lot of times, if let's say your announcement is a big event or conference. It's hard to get other publications to cover it because many of them actually have policies, which is we're only going to write articles covering our own conferences as opposed to other ones. So I think you're right there where they'll be more incentivized to cover ones after. I did want to mention, I should have before as well, one of the things you'll find with the media industry is that there's certain publications that are very time sensitive. So as an example, you think about like a TechCrunch. Like if you email TechCrunch 48 hours after something comes online, it's already old news, right? Like technology just moves so quickly. But one of the things you'll find is that there are also these historically, let's say something like Entrepreneur Magazine or even Forbes Magazine. Historically, these were monthly magazines, so they cared less about breaking stories and more about kind of overviews and kind of longer in-depth discussion. And also, you'll find, for example, certain industry verticals, let's say travel, they're just much less time sensitive. So going back to the story about the head of the World Bank visiting a town, I would say even if that happened a couple weeks later, maybe like a super time sensitive TechCrunch wouldn't cover it, but there are many magazines, etc., or others in the media who would still be interested in that story even if it happened later. Let's see. And any other questions before I continue? Oh, okay. I wanted to go into just kind of some thoughts on creating a product and kind of some philosophies that I have towards this. The first is there's a famous quote from Reid Hoffman, who founded LinkedIn, where he basically said if you launch the first version of your product and you're not embarrassed by it, you're basically launching too late. You're taking too much time. And it's something that I really subscribe to, because going back to when I first launched Publicize or these other startups, in hindsight, thinking about what the product was at that time, I'm really embarrassed about it, right? There are very limited features that we offer. There are all these things that in hindsight, I wish I had changed. But the reason why we were able to grow and accelerate and improve so quickly was because we went through that kind of challenging phase as well. And I mention it because there are so many friends of mine, for example, who they say like, hey, I want to launch my product in 1 month. And that 1 month, you talk to them and they say, oh no, I just want to add 1 or 2 more features. And 2 months goes by and they go, oh no, just a couple more features. And then those almost months go on to years. And there are probably many cases of people who've said, hey, it's been 2 years since I wanted to launch my product and I still haven't, right? So I really encourage each of you to say like, hey, for your launch, no matter what, your product in your company, whether it's consultancy, whether it's a product, etc., it's going to improve over time. That's just natural. And just to kind of have that kind of lean, just for each of you to lean towards taking that step. I think one of the things to keep in mind, again, I'm going to go back to another secret, okay? So I probably have tens of thousands of data points of startups and media coverage, right? From my own publications, from helping companies with TechCrunch, etc. Out of all those examples from startups, let's just say 10,000 data points for company launches. How many of those stories, if you had to guess, out of 10,000 have been negative? Maybe let's just get a guess. Out of 10,000. What comes to mind? What's up? Out of those 10,000 articles, how many of those articles were negative? Half? Half? So the answer is 1. But I want to explain why, because this is actually really important for each of you. So the way the media cycle works is, and this is true of anything, is that in the very beginning, it's important that people essentially get built up, which is why the articles that you read about new companies tend to be positive. Because if they weren't going to be positive, it's not that somebody would write a negative article, they would just choose not to write anything at all, right? So if you ever notice, like if you go to Los Angeles, for example, if there's like a homeless person and they fall in the street, like no one really cares. But if you see Kim Kardashian fall in the street, it's like the front page of like People magazine, right? And so what you'll find about the media industry as well is that when you're first getting started, all the coverage will be positive. And then once your company reaches a certain size of like importance and influence, then people say like, hey, we got to kind of bring them down, right? Elon Musk, it's a perfect example. Perfect example of that. Like when he was first starting off, all the praise was positive. So the reason why that's important for each of you, though, is many of you are probably thinking, hey, when I'm launching my product, I'm really worried because people are going to talk negatively about it, whatever it may be. But you should keep in mind, in the very beginning, people are always really positive about it. There's kind of that positive reinforcement. So because of that, it should kind of give you this courage to say, hey, I am going to be really proactive about it. And again, you talk to a lot of founders and they say they usually, I don't know, I think about my first company, I was so worried that people would kind of judge me or like think it was kind of weird that I was starting my company. And one of the things you'll find, I think other entrepreneurs would say the same thing, is actually the opposite is true. Many people will come up to you and say like, hey, I have so much respect. That's so neat that you're launching and founding your own company. You don't see many people doing that, which, you know, I just think it's fantastic to see. I wanted to mention, for each of you, I recommend when you do decide to launch your company, before you start advertising, before you start reaching out to influencers or the media, to do what I call, it's called kind of an alpha launch. And the idea is that to kind of test out your idea with just a few close friends, especially if it's anything technical, any type of website or product online. What I would do is I'd ask my friends, I'd say like, actually try to break the website, like find all these bugs, because there are always going to be a lot of things, kind of errors that pop up. And it's better that you find it from your close friends as opposed to launching out into the public and not even knowing about it. And I think the third point is to seek negative feedback. So one of the things you'll find with you know, all of these different companies that you're going to be starting is that most people don't want to give any negative feedback. They always want to say, hey, that's a great idea, right? And it's really important to kind of to ask them, say, hey, I want to hear what you don't like about it, because that's the only way you're really going to get better, right? That's the only way your company's going to grow, is by seeking out kind of those negative thoughts. Just a couple things, especially when people are starting off, is focus on building a minimum viable product. And the idea is focusing on one or two key features that people really want and really care about. There's some great books, for example, the Lean Startup by Eric Ries is fantastic. Somebody named Steve Blank as well. His principles about kind of customer feedback and building these products is super important. You know, one of the things you'll find, you see a lot of founders, they'll go to developers and say, hey, this developer told me it's going to take, you know, it's going to cost $100,000 to build. It's going to take, you know, 18 months. And when you actually look at what they're looking to build, the reality is what your clients actually care about is it's probably only a small fraction of what you're actually building. So it's really important in the very beginning to kind of hone in on like what is the value that you're going to be adding to different clients, to your customers, etc., and just focusing on that. The other thing to keep in mind is what matters most is product market fit. And the idea is that your product, you should build something that these customers really love, and ultimately it's your product that's going to drive a lot of the success of your company, much more so than a lot of this marketing, etc. And there's somebody named Sean Ellis. He coined the word growth hacking, and he actually had this great survey. And what he found was, if you want to know whether you've built a product that's going to take off, what you should do is you should give this survey that basically asks people, how much are you going to miss this product if you could not use it? And if at least 40% of the people say that they'll miss the product a lot, you know that you found product market fit, and you should raise a lot of money and really invest in marketing to grow the company. And I say that because a little while back, there was somebody named, he was one of the co-founders of Twitter, and he launched this product. And I remember, because he was a co-founder of Twitter, he has all this money, right? He got everywhere. The New York Times, The Guardian, everyone wrote about this product. But I remember looking at it, and I was thinking, you know, it's just not that great of a product. There's not a lot of value that you get from it. And the product, after a few months, basically faded away, and wasn't very successful. And when you think about it, it doesn't matter how much marketing or kind of media coverage you get. If people don't love your product, it's not gonna take off. So I'd really recommend in the very beginning focusing on how do you get the product right, how do you get your service, etc., solution right, and then once you have it right, then focus on the marketing to grow it as much as possible. And I think the last again is, you know, don't be afraid to fail. You know, I fail all the time, and just kind of part of the process. And yeah, I think that's. Let me see. I guess, you know, my email is conrad@publicize.co. I'm happy to send this PowerPoint to everyone. I'm happy to answer any questions or, you know, introductions, anything I can do to be of help. It's great to be in Astana. It's a beautiful city and beautiful country. And I don't know if there are any questions I could answer. I'm really happy to. Yeah.
You said guest articles. But I do it in locally in Uzbekistan.
Yeah,
So
awesome.
actually, for about a year, I'm writing guest articles in two popular startup publications. It really helps. But I have this problem, especially I think I will have this problem internationally because when you writing about a guest article, you just writing not about you, about the ecosystem or something like this.
Yeah.
And at some time you have your own personal announcement, and you kind of have to now say, I was doing this to, now I want to use my relationships to
Yeah.
be exposed for. I mean, when you build relationship as a guest writer, and at some point, but you already pursue some free PR in future, right?
Yeah.
How do you just shift so you don't feel
For sure.
awkward? I mean,
Yeah. Well,
did you have this problem? I really have this problem
yeah,
with
yeah.
this national publication.
I mean, it's a great question. I guess the first thought that came to mind is that, to me, when people are looking to build relationships with these different journalists or editors, it's so effective to be a guest contributor because now they're not like, hey, it's just a random founder. It's like, hey, that's a founder that's part of our team, and we want to help our team. To me, I wouldn't feel embarrassed about it. Just the one, I don't know, this going back to another secret that I found to be really effective is whenever I ask anyone in the media for something, I always end the email, the request with, I know you're really busy if you don't have the chance to respond. And by doing that, I just find it to be super effective about, you could ask an editor and say like, hey, my company is launching this. If you ever might be interested in writing about it, I know you're really busy if you don't have the chance to respond, if this isn't of interest. And to me, I think there's an understanding of, the reality is those journalists and editors at that newspaper, like they know you have your own successful company and are working on this. So it's not like you're telling them something that, oh, for sure.
You want to be sure that the story is not fake, it's valid,
For sure.
right?
Oh, 100%.
And the second question is, I think the most asked for you is that we here, really far from Silicon Valley in Central Asia, somebody even don't know where we're located. And have you seen some successes in a couple of years, maybe, when people just has this success stories when they're just pitching from the Uzbekistan or any Central Asia country, Kazakhstan, without really being. I know the stories when that's happening, that the companies from here have some investments in Silicon Valley, but mostly some of the co-founders or somebody is based there. But I don't know that somebody could make it really remotely from here. Is it still that case that being remotely here is a trouble to get some investment?
For sure. I mean,
in Silicon Valley.
Well, I think for media coverage, people could get it anywhere around the world. They don't need to be based there. To me, we're lucky right now. I still remember way back in the day, for one of my startups, people were like, "Hey, Conrad, you should look to raise money from this organization called Y Combinator. They're just starting off." And I was like, Y Combinator? They won 10% of my company for only like $10,000. There's no way I'm going to do that, you know? And then Y Combinator now is such this influential organization. It's so effective. So I think for many people looking to raise money in venture capital and maybe keep most of their team here, my initial thought would be looking to raise funding from, let's say, 500 startups is fantastic. I know Marvin's going to be speaking tomorrow, and he's a super nice guy. Y Combinator as well. And honestly, and even just, I'm happy to talk to people after, like you'll find there's this, it's a pretty small community of people who are interconnected, and like everyone's one degree of separation from somebody else. So I think it does help spending some time in Silicon Valley for sure. I don't think it's a requirement. I think it's possible just meeting people like international people, investors who, etc.
Or I guess we could just find somebody who's interested in this product, who will be a representative of in Silicon Valley. I mean, for example, you based close to Silicon Valley, we can just not write or pitch directly to venture capitals, but to somebody who has experience with talking with them, right?
For sure.
In this case, you could be the one that talking for us.
For sure, for sure.
Maybe this is the most rational way to do things.
Yeah, and I just think it matters. Somebody saying like a lot of my best friends investor at Greylock Partners. It's like Reid Hoffman's VC firm, and it just matters being able to say like, hey, I put my name behind this person. I met them. They're, a good person. They're someone you can trust. And I think in today's, people are, these venture capitalists want to meet good, serious founders just as much as good, serious founders want to meet venture capitalists as well. And so I think great companies can be built anywhere around the world. And yeah,
Thank you.
that's my, let's see. Oh, I want to thank Nursultan and NATD and Techstars Startup Week as well, of course. It's great to be here. Yeah.